All right, good morning. I'm Craig Elder. I'm the community manager for ArduPilot, and I've been doing that role since 2011. I was also the director of engineering for 3D robotics from 2011 to 2015. You may know a little bit about ArduPilot. 3DR was a company that was originally formed to support the open source autopilot, ArduPilot, and it has moved on to do some other things. And I spent some time with the Linux Foundation and now with the software in the public interest. So ArduPilot is an open source autopilot project used for autonomous aircraft or drones, if you prefer. We are the largest open source autopilot in the world by population and the third largest autopilot behind DJI and Parrot. We estimate we're somewhere in around 1.5 million vehicles around the world. And we are a part of software in the public interest, so we are also a not-for-profit. Give you an idea of the size of the project. In the last 30 days, we've had about 150,000 downloads of our copter code, 30,000 downloads of our plane code, and 300,000 downloads of the ground control station. And we get data on 12 to 15,000 flights a day, and we are growing quickly. Tell you a little bit about myself. If you look at this very iconic photo of the Canadian Rockies, most of you will have seen this place called Moline Lake. My dad was the district warden at Moline when I was growing up, and he spent 35 years in the National Park Service in Canada, and I was fortunate to be around 3 different national parks and had a lot of exposure to conservation from the time I was a little kid. So I'm a lot taller now, and I have not as much hair as I did back then. My background is actually electrical engineering with a focus in oceanography, and I've been designing remotely operated and autonomous vehicles for scientific research since the late 80s. I first started out building equipment for studying ocean mixing and how you get oxygen, carbon dioxide, and heat out of the atmosphere into the ocean. And we used to spend the winters in North Pacific or North Atlantic studying ocean storms. And this is a place where I learned about doing remote instrumentation development, because if the weather is going to be horrendous, you try to get as far away from it as possible. And from a technology point of view, it's an extremely challenging environment to make this kind of equipment work and have it work for weeks to months at a time. Also spent some time in the Arctic putting in instrumentation under the ice to measure ice cracking, helping people develop mathematical models for how much energy comes out of the sun, how that affects the way the ice breaks up and the ice moves around. And you see those kinds of models that are used for predicting ice flows and ice melting today. I've also spent some time making instrumentation for the deep ocean and helping people study the flora and fauna of hydrothermal vents. I also built this remotely operated vehicle for harvesting trees in hydroelectric dam reservoirs. So that's a bit about me. Recently, I've also spent a fair bit of time working in Africa doing conservation work with UAVs. We're doing both remote monitoring and anti-poaching efforts. Spent some time with Vulcan, Paul Allen, and the Elephants Without Borders project. Recently was in Kenya with the Kenya Wildlife Service, and also we've done some work with the World Wildlife Fund's anti-poaching efforts over there. So back to ArduPilot. ArduPilot is a very capable autopilot. It will allow you to fly a plane autonomously or a multi-copter. We have a number of different vehicles that we work with. So you can also drive a rover, which is a ground vehicle. We have a lot of people doing autonomous monitoring of securities facilities, and even autonomous lawn mowing is now becoming an application. We also have underwater robots with the submersibles. You mentioned in some of the briefing notes about OpenROV. OpenROV is a related project to ArduPilot. There's some of the same developers involved with both projects. And I spend a fair bit of time mentoring the OpenROV people, as well as the guys at Blue Robotics that are doing our subcode. We also fly traditional helicopters. They have generally have more payload than a multi-rotor does. So there's some people who prefer the traditional helicopter for long distance work, and an up and coming technology are the VTOL aircraft, where they use a combination of a fixed wing aircraft for efficiency and the multi-rotor for landing and taking off, and you get the best of both worlds without the hazards of flying a trad heli. So in terms of long-term payload, long-range payload, they're becoming extremely effective. We also provide antenna trackers for tracking vehicles at distance, and of course, then we also have a couple of different flavors of ground control stations that allow you to program what you want the vehicle to do and monitor it in real time if that's something you want to be able to do. Or we also have the ability just to let the vehicle go and do what it's programmed to do. It can be well beyond visual line of sight and well out of communications range. So ArduPilot works with a lot of companies. We have somewhere in excess of 1,000 companies around the world and 1,000 organizations that are building vehicles with our autopilot. We have a partner program where some of the more active companies work with us to integrate and develop the autopilot specific for their applications. One of the beauties of ArduPilot is we have the ability to integrate some open source code with closed source code. We spend a lot of time with something called a companion computer, where the artificial intelligence and the people have some proprietary capabilities, and they will integrate that with the autopilot, keeping the two of them separate. So that allows a company or an organization to develop their own AI, and it's separate from the autopilot itself. And we also have cloud capabilities. I know I'm hitting this quite quickly because in 10 minutes it would be impossible to cover all of the capabilities of ArduPilot, but I hope we can talk about that more in the discussion afterwards. So we have applications where we have taken a machine vision system. This particular one, we initially trained it how to identify cattle from the air, and that that allowed us to do the development work in North America, and we were able to teach the machine vision system how to tell the difference between a cow and a hay bale, and eventually worked up so that it would reliably track a herd of cattle. Eventually, we took that system and taught it how to identify elephants. We went to the elephant reserve down in Tennessee and tested down there, and eventually took it to Botswana and Namibia. And this has been used with the Paul Allen and the Elephants Without Borders for both tracking and counting elephant herds, as well as finding poachers. Basically, if you don't have 4 legs and you're a 2-legged creature, there's a reasonably good chance that you're a poacher out in the middle of nowhere. These have become very effective as a patrol aircraft because they're very difficult to see. They're very quiet, and it replaces manned aircraft and the dangers associated with having people in manned aircraft that might get shot down. You can do fleets of patrol aircraft without the problems of having manned aircraft up there. Just to touch on some other applications, this is a new one that you may have seen recently. It's a company called Drone Seed based out of Seattle that's planting trees with autonomous aircraft. So they fly a mission, they drop seed pellets, and they can cover a great deal of ground very quickly. Current project I'm working on is the black-footed ferret vaccination program. So we're dropping vaccine from autonomous aircraft. And one of the other developers, who's actually the lead developer on our Q ground control station, he's just come back from Africa. He's working with the Painted Dog Conservation and Rehab Center, tracking dogs with radio collars. And he's done quite a bit of work to integrate that kind of capability into the ArduPilot. So there's a lot of capability. I'll just put a little advertisement out there. There's a bunch of developers who are able to provide commercial support or custom software development, custom feature development for ArduPilot, and there's a bunch of us that have quite a bit of conservation interests. We're always very happy to see the ArduPilot being used for good, and want to be able to make sure that that's actively pursuing that. And we do have a large presence with our support forums and our wikis, and I'll have these links available at the end of the chat, and I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig. Are there any questions from the chat, from the participants? While we're waiting for people, I was just wondering, I know Rob's not in the chat right now, but one of the questions came from one of our community members, Rob, who was asking about automation, which is, I think, your thing, right?
Yeah.
His question was, how far can automation go, and is it more of a flight regulation or a technical challenge to completely automate everything?
So there's some regulations for as far as flying beyond visual line of sight, but primarily it depends. Those regulations depend on where you're working in terms of the limitations. When we've been working in Africa, there are no regulations about operating beyond line of sight. So we've been many tens of kilometers out and the autonomy is getting better all of the time. Our ability to track animals and do remote monitoring is increasing all the time.
I guess that kind of, there were quite a few questions that came up around regulations, and I think I know it's something that partner organizations of Wild Labs have struggled with, operating in so many different countries. Do you have any sense of like how conservationists who are looking to use drones can stay on top of what regulations, like they're changing so quickly? How do you stay on top of them?
Well, we have people located all over the world, so we have people in a lot of different countries that are paying attention to what those regulations are, and even contributing and consulting to the various regulatory agencies.
Yeah.
Given the size of ArduPilot, we work quite closely with the FAA here in the US. We work with CASA in Australia. We work with the Department of Transportation in Canada. I was doing a bit of work with the Kenyan aviation authorities when I was there in the spring. Everybody wants to know the capabilities, and they want to balance safety with the ability to go out and get work done.
Yeah.
So I think to answer your question, you need a bit of local knowledge, and getting out in and networking and asking somebody is going to know the right people to talk to.
Yeah. There are a lot of questions here, I think, that relate to your work with anti-poaching and different applications, but I'm actually going to hold them to the group discussion, because I think the other two speakers are probably going to have some input here as well, and it might be more interesting with the three of you are in it. So yeah. Thank you, Greg. We're going to hand over to Claire now.